would definitely or could definitely affect the stability of Egypt in the medium and long term. So this has been the case. What is after Corona? What is the case after we have Corona? Unfortunately, as I said, the regime has not utilized its vast amount of power that it has in order for proper handling of the coronavirus condition, the challenge. Unlike the case of China, as I said, so they the Sisi regime kept getting more powers and more authorities, claiming that this would help fighting the virus, but to the contrary, he's just getting more powers and he's not doing what it needs to be done. All the actually the policies of the regime are we have to understand that this is very important to understand. The policies of the regime and similar autocratic regimes are always directed to its first priority is the protection of the regime itself. Well, if this is okay, and if the well-being of the people matches this, fine. But if it doesn't, nobody cares. So the well-being of the regime, the stability of the regime, that it keeps staying in power, this is number one priority. And I'll explain how this is affecting the fighting of the virus. Uh, like any other country, there are two options. There has to be a balance between fighting, between the health of people, and opening up the country in order to preserve the economy. And this balance has to be maintained in a way that the country doesn't. Yani, we have healthy people without economy, or we have economy without people living. So there has to be a balance in order to fight that. But the regime, because the regime knows that it's to its best interest that the economy keeps running, and the economic situation in Egypt is already extremely in a bad shape. So the calculations of the regime was that if we have to forget a little bit about the virus and concentrate on continuing the economy open and having businesses working. Of course, there is also pressure from business people, etc. So the policies the regime has been adopting included policies of denial. There is nothing. I mean, we are okay. Egypt is preserved. Egypt is the best country in the world, that is leading the world in handling the virus. These have been the arguments probably in March. So we offer assistance to the world. The Minister of Health traveled to China, traveled to Italy to offer support. I know that Sisi even called Angela Merkel in Germany, offering her support, to fight the coronavirus in Germany, as if we are in a very relaxed case, and we are in a position to help others. When the virus started to pick up, the theory was similar to what probably Boris Johnson has adopted in the beginning, which is the immunity of the herd. Enough people will be sick, so that after a little while, the whole society will be immune, but we shouldn't shut down the economy. But the problem with Egypt is that this doesn't work. First, this doesn't work anywhere. I mean, it has been proving that this doesn't even work in Britain or anywhere else because of many reasons. But in Egypt, this is particularly impossible to work. First of all, the economy itself cannot be fixed this way. This doesn't help the economy, because the economy of Egypt depends depends on resources that is coming from international resources. Almost, there is very little production. So the economy is severely affected by variations that are taking place worldwide. And of course, the whole world is suffering. So it is natural that Egypt is suffering as a consequence. There are a lot of details. I don't have time to go through all these details, but in summary, the letting the economy open doesn't help, because there is no economy, and no production, no money coming from through tourism, or from revenues coming from Egyptians abroad, or exporting oil, anything like that. So it doesn't help. So the problem is that while the economy is stagnant, and it kept suffering. The reserve, the hard currency reserve, lost something like 20% of its value in just 2 months, and that is why the IMF very quickly had, in order to give Egypt a very quick loan, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But the economy is in a very bad position, and people are losing jobs in millions. The problem is that, so the economy, the policies did not help the economy. Meanwhile, coronavirus cases started to rise highly, and particularly starting maybe 2-3 weeks ago. And so the regime shifted its policy in media and in its discourse from downgrading the virus to the following. Well, we have the government, this is the argument. The government has done everything it could in order to immune the community from the virus. The problem is with the Egyptians. The Egyptians don't listen to instructions. Egyptians are careless. They move everywhere. There is a very high illiteracy rate, and so people cannot really absorb the procedures for that. This kind of argument. So the Egyptians are the ones who are responsible for the spread of the virus, while the government is doing its best and the result is that the number of deaths is very much controlled. Of course, in order to prove that, the regime is playing with the numbers, simply playing with the numbers. No real numbers are giving at all. The numbers that are given by the regime, you cannot even multiply by a factor to get the real numbers, because they are just, somebody is faking the figures in order to get something that proves their arguments. So the regime is simply still in the same state of denial. We hear a lot about hundreds and hundreds of new cases, and unfortunately, the regime is almost silent, doing nothing about that. So we have a case that, and also the regime, we know quite well that the regime is very much capable of shutting down the country if it wanted to. This is what they have been doing when there are some political protests or anything like that. So if they wanted to shut down, they could have done that. If really the people are careless, as they say, they could have simply kept people home by force. But they didn't do that. What they care about is as I said, is always their stability as a regime. And what is encouraging the regime more is, as I said, the continuous international support. We have just seen a couple of days ago, the IMF approved a first tranche of a loan, immediate loan of $2.77 billion as a first tranche, and now they are negotiating other tranches that could take the total sum to some $8 billion, maybe in a month or two. This is huge, and the loan that was just completed by the IMF to Egypt, $12 billion, is almost in the wind. I mean, nobody knows what happened with it. What is the impact of that loan on the Egyptian economy? The problem was that the money came and was spent, and that's it. And the IMF still keeps funding the Egyptian government to maintain the stability of the regime without any actually conditions, without anything, without even the basic IMF economic conditions. This is just money that you take in order to be able to control your budget, and that's it. Nobody is asking you how this money is going to go. So this is, and the regime is still actually, unfortunately, is not even using this money to fight this money or other money available to it to fight the pandemic. It is still going ahead with the large project, the new capital city, the etc. etc. And so the nobody knows actually what is going to happen. So in order to conclude, uh, uh, what is the future in light of all this? Unfortunately, the future is very bleak. And I'm very sorry to say that for my country. And but this is very clear to me. And if you look at the health condition of people, that is deteriorating, and it's going to deteriorate more because the regime is not doing anything. The authority, the government is not doing anything actually to to control that. The economy is in a very bad condition. The IMF is just giving injections that will just keep the regime standing, but not really influencing the real economy. So the economy is going to get worse. People are going to lose more jobs, and nobody knows actually where this is leading to. And for Egypt, there is a particular also a particular factor, which is the Nile water that is about to be controlled by Ethiopia using the Renaissance Dam that is already completed and is going to shut down most of the water that used to be coming to Egypt, which will severely affect the agricultural land in Egypt and will cause a lot of widespread poverty and all that. So, what is expected? Of course, the regime will continue. People will start to object, to project, to raise their voices. The regime will use more power, will use more oppression in order to control that. People will not stand the living conditions they are in anymore, so they will have higher voices. The regime will have higher oppression, and this will continue until, unfortunately, what many people expect will lead to chaos. This may not be an immediate condition, but probably within months from now, a case of chaos will take place. And this is I don't think in other countries with conditions similar to Egypt, the outcome would be different. Maybe details would be different, but this is typical of autocratic regimes who are not using, they are not even using the powers they have to the benefit of the country, to benefit of fighting the virus, but they are using, even they are using the virus itself in order to enhance the powers they have, and the people will, God will be with them. But this will be a condition of total chaos. Then what will happen? I believe what will happen is that a new condition will emerge. I don't think the regime could stand a condition like this much longer. It's a matter of months, maybe a year, maybe two. I don't know. It depends on the development of the virus and what will happen more. But I'm sure that a total case of change on completely new grounds will emerge. Uh, Unfortunately, in order to reach that condition, we will suffer. The Egyptian people will suffer a lot, either from the regime or from the bad conditions or from the chaotic nature of events. But change will happen. Change will come, and a total different, in my opinion, I think a total different country will emerge with more power to the people, with a more decentralized state, where the authorities are distributed to the local councils and governorates and all that. We have a new model for development that will concentrate probably first on the well-being of the typical Egyptians based on a village model, to satisfy the basic need of people rather than adopting economic policies that will only benefit 1% of the Egyptians, like what is happening right now. And actually, by the way, even this 1% now is suffering, and it's raising their voice, and they will also, I believe, they will also join the protest that will emerge soon. So we will see a new country with a new development model that is concentrated on the human being, what is best for the human being, his dignity, his education, his healthcare, and so hopefully from this case we will see another good condition that will emerge. And I believe that this is out of the misery that we are living in all over the world. The developing countries will eventually develop these models that will be to their best. This is what I have to say today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You are very hopeful in this, and that is really appreciated. People need some hope these days. It is really grim. Now I open the floor. We have about 5 minutes to 6 minutes questions and answers. All speakers are welcome to stay after the session, and as well as the attendees if they would like to entertain more questions. So I would just want to keep that in mind for all attendees as well as the panelists. That has been the case in the previous ones, and we'll make it also available for all our panelists and our attendees today as well. So I think, Dr. Darrag, you have 3 questions in there. One, it says, are you in Egypt? The other one, are you a former ambassador of Egypt, or is the Egyptian army really ruling the country? These are the questions I think we have for you here.
Okay. No, I'm not living in Egypt. If I was living in Egypt, I wouldn't have been speaking to you right now. I would have probably been in a cell somewhere in the Scorpion prison. No, I'm not. I'm living in Istanbul. I'm running now a think tank. I was minister in the cabinet that was overturned by the military coup of Mr. Sisi, General Sisi. You're asking if the military is ruling Egypt. Yes, this has been the case since 1952. There was a military coup against the kingdom, against the king that was ruling Egypt at that time. People at that time thought that by siding with the military, they would get better governance, they would get rid of the British occupation at that time. But very quickly, a dictator model, an autocratic model emerged. And we are actually, in Egypt, we are oscillating between 2 conditions, but both of them are under the control of the military. Whether the military, either the military are ruling the country explicitly, and this happened several times over the last 70 years, or a military person or a former military person is governing supported by the military. Sisi, for example, when the military coup took place back in 2013, the military was in charge until the end of 2014, until Sisi became president. And so Sisi put on the civilian suit and started ruling as a civilian, although all the time he's talking about the military. And so this is the case in Egypt. It is more or less a military rule, whether explicitly or behind the cover.
Thank you. All right. As you know, attendees, you can raise your hand in your. If you are on the computer, to the right, there is a way that you can raise your hand, and then we'll be able to give you a chance to speak through the microphone, through your microphone, so we'll be able to hear you. If I don't have, okay, I have one here. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Wendy, you can go ahead now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm unmuting you, so you should be able to.
Yeah. Okay.
You have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Osama, and it's good to see Dr. Amr Darrag in this great presentation that he did. My question is briefly, in general about the Egyptian opposition. Would this pandemic maybe provide a good opportunity to the Egyptian opposition, even from outside the country? And obviously outside is probably at this moment is the better opportunity to work together. And to maybe build coalitions, build some opposition fronts that would that not necessarily have a specific political color to oppose the military regime in Egypt. Would this pandemic present this chance, and is there such a chance from where you sit, Dr. Amr? Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mungi. Yes, of course, you are right. This is what we have been trying to do. And we have been reaching, before the pandemic, we have been reaching good agreements among opposition figures in order to try to work together outside of the ideological or political differences for just one aim, which is to change the miserable condition in Egypt right now. Definitely, the condition of the coronavirus is giving us another motive in order to expedite this, and this is what is happening now. And if you follow the media that is representing the opposition outside Egypt, you'll find a lot of this sentiment, and you'll find a lot of work and discourse towards Egyptians in order to address this. And I just will have another comment. I just saw the question by Dr. Anas Takriti and also your comment, Dr. Osama, about the optimistic vision that I gave. Actually, I don't think I gave an optimistic vision. I talk about total chaos for about a year or two, which is nobody knows how this could emerge, whether in the middle of it or later on could emerge to the bright picture that I would like to see in Egypt. But of course, if you have a chaotic condition like this with massive numbers of very sick people and without the basic needs to allow their living because of the very bad economy, and also if you add to that the issue of the Nile water, this will be really bad. And what is worse is that the regime actually made sure over the last 7 years to empty the society from any power that could help. There are no political powers. I'm talking about inside Egypt. No political powers, no civil society, no media that is helping people, nothing. And the only power that is taking charge is the military, and they are doing this badly. So if the military itself couldn't handle this, unfortunately, they will. The price of emptying the scene will be paid. I don't really know. There is no organized power that could take charge of the chaos in order to direct it into a positive direction. So I'm not being optimistic. Actually, it is going to be, I believe, very, very difficult. Maybe a couple of years we are heading to, but I'm sure that at the end somebody will rise, whether the opposition outside or somebody will emerge from Egypt that would put the vision. We are actually working on things like that. We are developing a lot of plans and policies in terms of the items that I discovered. But there has to be some preparation for the scene in order to be able to absorb these policies for the best of the people, I hope.
Okay, thank you very much. The time is up for the first presentation. Please stick with us, and hopefully maybe at the end also there would be some more questions if you would like to stay. Next, we will be joined by Ms. Frances Brown. She comes from a good background. Again, all the bios of our speakers, just for the sake of time, I'm trying not to read everybody's bios, but I did put the link there that you can hear. Her presentation is how's coronavirus affecting conflict zones and fragile states. It's kind of major trends. Ms. Brown, it's all yours.
Great, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you all here today. Thank you, Osama, for the generous introduction and for the invitation. So Speaking of optimistic visions or non-optimistic visions, I'm afraid I do not have a very optimistic story for you today, but I hope it'll be informative. We at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is my research institute, we last month released a major study looking at how the pandemic may affect 12 different conflicts and 12 different sort of fragile states around the world. You can find this on the Carnegie website, and I'll put it in the chat box after I finish speaking as well. So I invite you all to read. So this is a compilation from 12 different country experts. It's edited by my colleague Jarrett Blanc and myself. And we, in the introduction, sort of try to pull out some high-level trends of what parallels we see throughout multiple conflict areas of how the pandemic is likely to affect them. It's worth noting this is a really preliminary story, and much of the analysis was, of course, very speculative. As you all know, the pandemic was slower to arrive in some conflict-affected areas, and we're just beginning to see the ramifications. Obviously, this will be played out over the course of months and unfortunately years, but we still think it's helpful and informative to look at some of these high-level trends, and then, of course, to think about what we can do collectively on the international community, in the relief and assistance community, to perhaps stave off some of those worst outcomes. The other thing to note up front is that, of course, there's tremendous local variation. So while I'll go over some high-level trends, many of you who are working much closer to the ground and in some of these areas will, of course, have more granular perspectives. But that is our intention here, is just to pull out some high-level trends and think about what we might see going forward. As I mentioned, it's a bleak picture. I apologize in advance. But then at the end, I also do have some brief thoughts on policy implications for practitioners who are trying to be part of the relief effort and the assistance effort, essentially what we can all do to stave off some worst outcomes. So a few high-level trends that we're seeing across the world. The first trend is that in many conflict-affected states, the pandemic is a test of effectiveness for all formal state authorities, and of course for all formal aspiring state authorities as well. And this will have implications for legitimacy and popular support in the long term in some ways we can't always predict. So one example of this is in Kashmir. An analyst in our compilation described how residents in Kashmir are viewing this as a test of whether the Indian government in Delhi can actually deliver effective governance, effective services, which you may recall last year when Delhi revoked the special status of Kashmir. That was the rationale that this would be a better way to deliver governance. So it's early to say. It does seem like Kashmiris are largely accepting the lockdown being imposed currently there. So we'll see what happens there. Another example is in the breakaway Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. Our analyst there wrote that if either of the so-called parent states, so that is either Russia or Ukraine, provided an effective pandemic response, that would probably win them support. And I think the jury is still very much out in these areas. Of course, the corollary to this point about it being an effectiveness test for authorities is really that in the many places in which there's fragmented governance arrangements because of ongoing wars, that makes effective response so much harder. So a couple examples of this that will be well known to many of you. Of course, Syria, as you know, is divided up between at least three domains, between the Assad regime on one hand, the Northeast region, the other, Idlib. And so obviously, in addition to all the political complications this brings, it has real humanitarian and response ramifications, because internal borders make a response all the more hard. We've heard that the Northeast has not been able to access tests without going through Damascus, et cetera. So it's really challenging from just a human suffering perspective. Another place where there's fragmented governance arrangements, sort of de facto, is Afghanistan. Of course, there's the National Unity Government, or the government of President Ashraf Ghani, which has been going through its own political crisis after a disputed election. But then the Taliban, of course, controls many parts of the country as well. So here again, when you think about the holistic response needed to actually bring this pandemic under control, these fragmented arrangements make it all the harder. We're seeing a sort of parallel story in Libya as well. We've got the competing government of the UN recognized administration on one hand, and then we've got the regime of Khalifa Haftar on the other. Here again, unfortunately, civilians are the losers in this kind of competitive governance arrangement. So that's one broad trend. The other thing to say about just this overall trend of the pandemic being an effectiveness test for authorities is that many government authorities, of course, realize this and want to be seen as being effective, even if they are not. So many are using concealment and disinformation as a tactic around the virus. So we've seen this at various times from the Assad regime in Syria, from Yemen, from various actors in Yemen. The North Korean leadership denied coronavirus for a long time. Iran, questions of counting numbers in Iran. We've seen this in breakaway Eastern Ukraine. We've seen this in Belarus. So in all these areas, there was a long time in which authorities claimed there was no virus or less virus than there was. Obviously, that has huge and horrible implications for human suffering, because you can hide a pandemic for a little while, but you clearly can't hide it forever. So that's another bleak aspect of that trend to watch. The second big trend I want to raise is that in many conflict areas and fragile states, the virus is obviously a health emergency, but it's now on a collision course with pre-existing economic emergencies or economic hardships and pre-existing violence and conflict-related hardships. So you basically got these three crises all coming together in a really mutually reinforcing and problematic way. We're seeing a lot of examples of this in areas which many of you are familiar, particularly areas that have a large number of conflict displaced people, either internally displaced or refugees. So countries like Afghanistan, Syria and the Syrian displaced community, Iraq, Somalia, these all have huge populations of people who have been displaced by the conflict, now are even less able to work or get assistance, who fear the virus and fear the violence. It's a real sort of triple bind for these populations, unfortunately. We're seeing this another way in several regimes that are conflict affected and heavily reliant on oil revenues, which clearly are no longer as good a support. So places like Libya, Iran, Venezuela, Iraq, these are all places where we're seeing the economics further compound the health suffering and the conflict suffering. In sort of a different vein, across many parts of Africa, there's approximately 250 million who work in informal urban employment. And a lot of this obviously cannot be done remotely on Zoom like we are doing our own jobs. It's currently projected that about 27 million of those might be pushed into poverty as a result of the economic implications of COVID. So for a lot of people, it's unfortunately a bind between starvation and risk of the virus. Another example of this kind of bind is in Afghanistan. Afghanistan relies heavily on Kazakh wheat, wheat from Kazakhstan. So because trade has been halted and then put on a quota, there's a huge risk of starvation there. So the virus is compounding food insecurity in a really problematic way. So the next high level trend that I want to raise is that many nation states and also many leaders of nation states are instrumentalizing the pandemic to serve pre-existing objectives they may have already had. So they're sort of using this new context to advance their own agendas. One example of this is in Syria, where the Assad regime has been banding together with China and Russia to try to get sanctions relief. It's obviously been trying to get relief from sanctions, EU and US sanctions, for a long time, but now is using pointing to the pandemic as a reason why. Our collection also speculates that we might see something sort of parallel in North Korea where it's possible that we'll see China, South Korea, and the US all sort of jockey for a better bargaining position in any further talks by offering to provide assistance around the pandemic, emergency assistance. We'll see if that happens, but that's a possibility. We're also seeing leaders of nation states using the pandemic to consolidate their own power. There's a lot of examples of this, unfortunately, and many of you have been probably aware of developments in Hungary, where Viktor Orban has put forth emergency powers, very sweeping emergency powers, sort of in keeping with his own pre-existing agenda. We're also seeing a similar kind of trend in the Philippines, where Duterte has shut down the country's most powerful broadcaster, one that was also often critical of him. So again, using the pandemic as a pretext. So very problematic. The next big trend to highlight for you is that in many places, unfortunately, the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing ethnic tensions, and in some ways paved a potential pathway for further conflict. A couple examples of this, many of you may be familiar with the situation in India, where the group Tablighi-Jamaat was, and its headquarters was cited as an early source of corona infections back several weeks ago now. Unfortunately, that has led to a broader scapegoating of Muslim communities at already sort of, laid upon an already really complicated dynamic between many Muslim and Hindu communities in India. The BJP party in India, several of its leaders called the Jamaat's meeting Corona terrorism and used the hashtag Corona Jihad that went on social media. So there's also been a lot of misinformation spread around Muslims. So obviously a really problematic and troubling trend there. Another example of this trend of ethnic tensions being exacerbated by the virus is in Myanmar. The Myanmar military has stepped up attacks on ethnic minorities in various states while the rest of the country is dealing with the pandemic. So it's escalating offensives. A couple of the ethnic armed groups in which were being targeted actually offered to extend a ceasefire, but that was not reciprocated by the Myanmar military. So again, a troubling trend to watch. Another big trend to highlight is that many non-state actors, transnational groups, have their own responses to the pandemic. Of course, they're using it for their own ends, both to instrumentalize it and then also to use it as an opportunity to shore up legitimacy, to shore up popular support, basically to jockey for position, potentially. So on non-state armed groups instrumentalizing the pandemics, many of them are doing this to exert control on a population or to expand territory or for propaganda purposes. A few examples of this, ISIS in mid-March in its newsletter sort of released an encouragement for its fighters to carry out attacks worldwide while many governments are obviously under stress dealing with the pandemic and while many military counterterrorism efforts are sort of on the back foot. It's hard to get accurate numbers on this, but according to ACLED, the source ACLED, we have seen ISIS-affiliated attacks subsequently increase or happen in places ranging from Niger to Egypt to Afghanistan to Mozambique. And then of course in Iraq, we're seeing ISIS take advantage of the diminished international counterterrorism and Iraqi government counterterrorism forces to expand its own operations. And it seems like their operations are on the upswing there as well. Separately from ISIS, in Libya, we're seeing multiple armed groups try to weaponize the crisis. My colleague Fred Wary in this collection talks about how the pandemic is providing an opportunity for the Eastern-based commander Khalifa Haftar to use the pandemic to further militarize governance, which has been something he's been trying to do for a long time, but this gives him an opportunity to. Haftar's also continued an assault on Tripoli, so definitely not heeding the call for a global ceasefire, and had in violation of a purported ceasefire that was hatched earlier. Separately, in Colombia, we're seeing reports of armed groups and death squads taking advantage of the Colombian government's distraction to murder land rights activists. So very troubling there. On another vein, we're seeing some groups instrumentalize the crisis for recruitment purposes. So in Yemen, some of the Houthi movements have stated, Houthi movement activists have stated in their media that it is better to die a martyr in heroic battles than dying at home from the coronavirus. So it's sort of a recruitment push. Similarly, in Somalia, Shabab has blamed the virus on crusader forces and basically kept up their previous pace of attacks. We're also seeing similar language in Mali from JNIM, Al-Qaeda's branch in the Sahel. It released a statement saying that COVID-19 is a God-sent soldier weakening invaders and the Malian forces. And we've seen an uptick in terror attacks there too. So that's sort of on the instrumentalization side. The other big trend we're seeing on non-state actors is on many of them trying to respond to the crisis with relief, service delivery, etc. This is obviously good in many cases for suffering populations. It's also likely with an eye towards shoring up support from the population and legitimacy. So very quickly in Afghanistan, the Taliban has rolled out its own public awareness campaign on sanitation, going door to door with temperature checks and distributing hand sanitizer. There's a lot of questions about how legitimate this effort is versus if it's just a public relations stunt, but they're certainly being very public about it, while the Afghan government is visibly struggling to respond effectively to the virus. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, Hezbollah has ramped up its already robust social healthcare facilities and campaign, distributing food parcels, adding to testing centers, repurposed over a dozen private medical centers, and making sure that it's bringing journalists along for the ride to report on it. On a separate vein, in Brazil, there's reports of drug trafficking gangs in Rio imposing a curfew to contain the virus. Reports of gangs in El Salvador enforcing social distancing regulations. In Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel is handing out food and toilet paper packages that they're calling Chapo packages. So this is another trend to watch, essentially. Obviously, in all these cases, the response isn't totally altruistic. These groups may be also trying to shore up response. And the final big trend I want to mention is more about the international community and international and non-governmental assistance efforts. The pandemic is unfortunately undermining a lot of efforts to resolve conflicts and assist with dialogue, assist with response in really concrete ways. So just a couple examples of this. In Somalia, there had been an ongoing sort of federal government, regional state dialogue process that was underway or sort of needed to get more underway. And now, because of the pandemic, the international community is essentially pulled back in a large way from Somalia. So this dialogue would have to occur with much less in-person support from the international community. Similarly, in Afghanistan, a next step that is meant to happen after the initial US-Taliban agreement was an intra-Afghan dialogue, an inclusive intra-Afghan dialogue on the nature of the Afghan state. Many things have stalled this, not least the political crisis among the Afghan government, but the pandemic has certainly stalled this as well. And it's obviously very hard to build trust remotely, to actually advance an inclusive dialogue process remotely. The virus is also undermining internationally assisted peacekeeping efforts. In many African Union countries, the lockdowns and social distancing measures have made it hard for new peacekeeping staff to come into countries and support missions. It obviously also undermines peace building efforts, local level community dialogues, et cetera, which really require in-person gathering. And again, the technology environment in many of these countries is not such that they can just move it all over to Zoom. And then finally, the pandemic also undermines aid distribution in a lot of places. Lockdowns obviously make aid distribution harder. And in addition, perceived inequities in the way aid packages are distributed in some places like Ghor province in Afghanistan have led to violent protests. So there's sort of a further flashpoint created by the pandemic and the response, which is problematic. So final thoughts, I promised you this would not be optimistic, and it has not been. And it's obviously been a pretty bleak picture on how the pandemic is exacerbating conflicts around the world. But I will say that we do know also that natural disasters can sometimes provide positive disruption or a window of opportunity. It can shuffle the deck in potentially productive ways sometimes. We often hear about the 2004 tsunami helping to lead a pathway to peace in Aceh, although the tsunami also affected Sri Lanka and did not lead a pathway to peace in that country. So it's all to say that it is possible. It's early at this stage to predict where positive opportunities might emerge and what those might be. I think, it's early to say, and it's hard to say from my 30,000 feet vantage point that I've just given you. But I think we all in the international community, in the non-governmental community, relief actors who care about peace and security and conflict resolution, we all have an interest to closely watch potential openings, communicate about potential openings, and make sure that our own bureaucratic and programmatic tools are ready to support any opportunities that do emerge, be ready to mobilize quickly. So on that note, that somewhat positive note, I will leave you and I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much. That was really a good tour around the world, if you mean, in 20 minutes to have a good view of what's going on around the world. Thank you very much. I think we are going to have questions and answers for you. If we can just, if you can hold with us until the end of the session, just to make sure that we get everybody. We got 5 minutes that we can take questions now, and we can also have after the session, we can have more questions. Okay, this question that I have is for the first speaker. No, I need a question for this particular presentation, but I know there would be a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions. Go ahead.
I see one that might be related about if the politics in COVID-19 were taken out of how well would we be able to overcome this virus. Okay. I'm not sure who that was to. Oh, I guess it was to all panelists. Okay. But I can take a shot at that.
Sure, absolutely.
Absolutely. So my personal view is that dealing with this pandemic requires cooperation among every level, and global cooperation, local and national cooperation, and that I personally believe the framing of this virus as a sort of competition. We're hearing a lot in US policy circles about great power competition, assigning blame to China or not. I personally believe that's incredibly detrimental to the actual competition at hand, which is between the virus on one hand and humanity on the other. And this virus is obviously underscored. Borders or the virus does not respect borders. It doesn't respect border walls. It doesn't respect immigration restrictions. The virus is actually incredibly innovative in a really horrible way and incredibly persistent. And so if collectively we aren't able to come up with a response, I fear the virus is going to win. So when we talk about politics being taken out of it, I think unfortunately that's what does need to happen, because again, this is a fight between humankind and the virus. It's not a fight between any two countries, or it shouldn't be framed that way.
Thank you. That was very, very good answer and very good way to put it out there. Thank you very much. I have to move now to a videotape from one speaker who could not join us, and it talks about this particular one. And then we are going to have, after that, Ambassador Robert Ford, and at the end of the session, we will have questions for the last speaker and for all the speakers with us here. So I'm going now to play this video that we have from one of the speakers that we wanted to have, but unfortunately we could not. I don't know if everybody can hear well.
Leading development and humanitarian NGO in the MENA region. I am joining you today from Doha. Speakers and attendees are joining us from all over the world. Yet we are all faced with the exact same challenge, the exact same question today. Now, what? The corona pandemic has caused dramatic changes in our lives, and I doubt that the world will ever be the same. Profound transformation are waiting ahead. When we go back in history, we see that times of global turmoil like this have led to radical changes in humanity. Previous pandemics have brought about lasting transformation that became an integral part of our lived reality today. Sadly, the impact of any given global tragedy would be even bigger today. Civilization have spent centuries building a modern, globalized world through political, economic, industrial, and digital revolution. But today, what was a blessing has proven to be a curse. Today, a single person stardom, tragedies, sickness can affect all humanity, and a single sector failure can make all industries fall one after the other like a house of cards. Today, I want to stay within my expertise and give my perspective on the after COVID-19 world in regards to the civil society sector. I would like to start by briefly going over the common perception of the third sector. The civil society sector is an essential component of the contemporary state. It is called the third sector because it represents the third side of the state alongside the government sector and the private sector. The better the level of partnership and cooperation between these three sectors, the higher the development indicator of the country. These three sectors have to be in a continuous synergy and harmony at all times. However, what distinguishes the civil society sector and this tripartite partnership is four main features. First, civil society sector is considered as an indicator of the state of democracy. Second, civil society is a major actor in building and strengthening national social cohesion. Third, civil society is a development and humanitarian partner that we can't deny. Fourth, civil society is a strong and concrete embodiment of the universal human conscience. Now, back to our topic today. Looking at the future of the sector after the corona pandemic and the potential transformation ahead of it, two scenarios are predicted. The first one is how the sector's mere existence may be jeopardized. The second is how its roles within the society will be impacted. The two scenarios are, of course, interlinked and complementary. Both scenarios have to be considered and planned for in order to preserve the existence and integrity of the sector in a post-pandemic world. The civil society sector, with its interlinked elements and roles, is considered a valuable asset that societies have achieved. It is the fruit of a long historical struggles led by societies to win their legitimate right to participate in public affairs and produce a democratic political system based on legislation, policies, and institutions. First of all, in order to address the impact of the corona pandemic on the existence of or survival of the civil society sector, we must look at three fundamental pillars on which the sector is based. The first pillar is about solid values and public interest. The second one is about principles of democracy and human rights. The third one is about financial sustainability. Solid values and public interest are a policy blueprints, particularly during exceptional circumstances and crises. They act as the foundation that navigates our intervention and action when facing crisis and supporting recovery. These human values, which are firmly established in all societies, will represent a strong support for strengthening the role of community of civil society in this pandemic and in the future as well, given the devastating effects it will have. On the other hand, significant challenge that we may face today is that non-democratic and authoritarian systems can exploit the current societal fragility to reverse the democratic gains made by the sector over the last decades. Another big challenge is securing funding and financing. The civil society sector depends on donation and grants to carry on its mission. This might be faced with significant shortages as a result of the economic downturn. Again, this will not just affect its mission, but will also threaten the existence of a large part of the civil society sector altogether, especially in countries where the government doesn't directly support the sector. No industry has been spared by the economic disaster today, but the civil society sector is entitled to its right to exist. Stimulus and public support granted to industries by government should not exclude the civil society. I will now move on to the second scenario concerning the possible shift in the civil society roles. Inevitable transformations are expected after the pandemic. The civil society sector's intervention and action are a response to the needs of societies and communities. Evaluating how the roles of the third sector might change in a post-pandemic world will be carried out according to 4 aspects. Sustainable development goals, disaster and crisis reduction, defending the causes of the underprivileged, and the 4th one is the mechanisms of the international solidarity system. The effort to achieve sustainable development goals and also to enhancing the capabilities of disaster risk reduction will witness a significant decline in the light of the corona pandemic. This will even force the United Nations itself to review and rework these goals. The civil society sector, as a development and humanitarian partner, also needs to consider its priorities in light of the current scene, especially in area of combating poverty and social fragility and its impact on the social ladder. Civil society organizations will not be required to provide services only to the needy, but rather to communicate their issues and concern globally. We can already see some of the deep changes that the pandemic has produced within the sector. For example, we are witnessing how civil society organizations can rapidly repurpose and reorient their priorities. For established civil society groups, switching from long-term development projects to emergency assistance is a natural shift, but we now see that even grassroots organizations that typically work on democracy issues are swiftly repurposing to address the urgent humanitarian needs created by the crisis. The third sector has again proven its ability to promptly adapt to the community needs, unlike public intervention that require a great deal of planning, preparation, and regulation. Besides these small changes, we are now headed for more fundamental amendments in the international solidarity system. There are 2 reasons to this conclusion. First, the global solidarity has already begun to reshape the higher political sphere, creating great transformations in the concept of international relation. This will consequently create a fracture in the old political and economic blocs. The second reason is linked to the growing role of what we now call the emerging donors, who will provide new perception of development and humanitarian aid and international relations in general. To conclude, the corona pandemic will undoubtedly change the face of the civil society sector as we know it. We will witness the formation of a new map of aid through civil society, through which civil society organizations should make great effort to cement their new position within the global scene. If we have learned something from history, it is that the civil society sector has always emerged as an essential building block of national cohesion in the aftermath of global crisis. The impact of this crisis is like nothing we have ever seen, but the civil society has developed a centuries-long resilience and has proven to be more versatile and adaptable than any other sector. But whatever changes happen, a new normal, whatever it may be, will set in for the third sector in a post-pandemic world. Finally, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you our opinion and concern about the future of the civil society in the aftermath of coronavirus pandemic. Thank you very much.
All right, this was the presentation by Mr. Abd Ben Sahra. He is the head of the Department of Planning and Development at the Qatar Charity. I think this was also the center of our discussion in the last session we had with Mr. Mark Ward and Mr. David Harden and Christina Tobias Nahi. All the speakers were talking about the same issue, the future, especially in the relief and the assistance. So we will have now, we are going to move now with our fourth speaker, Ambassador Robert Ford, who was the US ambassador to Syria, and he had other positions as well. And again, for the interest of time, all the bios are on our website. The link was posted on the chat. I would like to move it now to Ambassador Ford, and please everybody stick with us around. We will have more questions to entertain. Ambassador Robert Ford, it's all yours now.
Thanks, Osama. It's nice to be with the group today, and let me wish everyone who is celebrating, wish them and their families a happy and blessed month of Ramadan. I'm going to talk a bit about where the world is going. Francis talked about fragile states and conflict situations. I'm going to actually talk about a similar topic, but from a different angle, which is to say, what's going to happen with the big countries, and in particular, the United States, Russia, and China, and what that means for places like the Middle East. So I have a presentation. I'm going to put it up on the screen now. So the first thing is I guess I need to explain what is a world order. And the easiest way I think I could say it is that a world order is how the different countries in the world work with each other and interact. And at the end of the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed into a series of different countries, including Russia, the United States was the #1 world power. And not just militarily, although certainly militarily was the #1 world power, but also economically, it was the #1 world power, and even technologically and culturally, it was the world's #1 power. And so the United States could intervene in countries really without having to worry about a reaction from Russia or China. And so it did intervene in Bosnia in the 1990s, and it did intervene in Iraq in 2003. And it really did it without any country able to restrain it. But the United States also built institutions around the world to help it maintain the American preferred vision of international stability. And so that included the United Nations. The picture on the right is the headquarters of NATO in Brussels. And there are lots of other organizations I could put pictures up. The World Trade Organization that governs trade flows, the World Bank, the IMF. There are a variety of organizations that the United States had set up after the Second World War, in some ways in response to World War II. They did not want a repeat of World War II. And those institutions, United Nations, NATO, World Trade Organization, IMF, World Bank, all helped the United States maintain a sort of stability in the 1990s and in the 2000s. But there have been a lot of changes over the last 10, 12 years. Of course, I think most people here will remember the financial crisis that this country had 12 years ago. And I know everyone will remember the American intervention in Iraq, which I think has had a far more profound and deep political impact on the United States than many people this is still an issue for American foreign policy, and there's still arguments about what should be done in places like Iraq and Iran, and these come directly out of the American experience in Iraq. Similarly, the American intervention in places like Libya and Syria were very much influenced by the negative American experience in the Iraq War. So starting about 10 years ago, the Americans decided they did not want any longer to be responsible for maintaining stability everywhere. And so President Obama decided not to intervene in Syria when the Russians sent their Air Force. And I know that has been a controversial decision among some Americans and some communities in the United States. But President Trump actually has continued Obama's policy in places like Syria and Libya. President Trump has not intervened in Syria against the government of Bashar al-Assad, same as Obama. President Trump has not intervened to stop the fighting in places like Libya and Yemen. President Trump has made clear, as did Obama, that the United States should at some point withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. They can argue with the United States military about how to do that, what are the proper strategies and tactics. But both Trump and Obama reflect an American public opinion. People on this conference call, I think, live in the United States. You know, most want American soldiers to be in places like Iraq and Afghanistan forever. And this is what I'm talking about, that the world order from the time of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush is changing. The virus actually has come after that. But the impact on places like Syria, places like Libya, is very dramatic. But the impact is not only in the Middle East. This is a picture of Donald Trump at a meeting of the G7 leaders. These are leaders of the 7 biggest economies in the world, not including China. And as you can see, there's one man arguing with the rest of them. The Trump administration has created more tensions with American allies in places like Europe and Asia and even Canada than has any previous president. And there are questions now in places like Europe and Asia about the American willingness to act as a leader as we go forward. I just want to underline, this started before the virus. This goes back to the American dissatisfaction with the financial crisis and with the wars in the Middle East, and in particular Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's actually, now the virus is making this problem even more serious. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In the Obama administration, when the Ebola virus became serious in West Africa, the Obama administration decided to respond very quickly. It's an interesting story, which I studied 2 weeks ago. The Obama administration at first was relaxed about the Ebola virus in Africa because the World Health Organization said it's not a problem, it's under control. When the Obama administration began to understand that the Ebola virus was not under control, and an American citizen returned to the United States with the virus, the Obama administration had a sort of panic and put the American citizen in quarantine in Atlanta, where the Center for Disease Control is. And then immediately, the American administration under Obama contacted the World Health Organization and contacted countries in Europe, and in particular, France and Britain. Obama sent 3,000 American military forces to West Africa, and in particular to the state of Guinea, and also to Liberia and Ghana, where they set up mobile hospitals. The Obama administration worked at the United Nations and was able to get a Security Council resolution agreed by China, by Russia, by everyone, to declare the Ebola virus an international crisis. The Obama administration then worked very closely with the World Health Organization. The Obama administration sent hundreds of medical personnel from the United States to West Africa to work with the WHO and with medical experts from Europe to contain the virus in those West African countries. Those West African countries wanted the assistance, and they were very transparent about their needs. So they were easy for Americans to work with. They were good partners. Now, think about that and compare it to our experience in 2020. The Trump administration has not worked with China. China has been difficult to work with, and I'm going to speak about that in a moment. But the Trump administration has not worked with the WHO. The Trump administration withdrew medical experts from China last year, and only in February did they decide to send some to look at the situation again. But still, it took no action. It was very slow, unlike the Obama administration, which reacted very quickly once the first Ebola virus case was found in the United States. And the Trump administration in general has tried to downplay the seriousness of the virus situation. It has not helped its image around the world. And of course, now the United States has the most cases of the virus of any country in the world. So the American position in terms of its international leadership and in terms of its response has been much different from, say, even 10 years ago with the Obama administration. While this virus is getting everyone's attention now and China's involvement in the virus, it's important to remember that China for years has been increasing its power and its influence around the world. Its navy is much bigger and is now patrolling. The Chinese Navy even does military exercises in the Mediterranean Sea now. Think about that, in the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, its economic and commercial influence is gigantic. Its response on the coronavirus has been a mixed success. It has sent around assistance to different countries, and in particular to Europe and Latin America and Africa. It has sent some assistance to the Middle East. I should note, however, that this assistance at times has been discovered to be low quality and in some cases not usable. Some countries have actually sent the Chinese materials back to China saying that they are not good and that they are more dangerous because they give a false sense of security. The Chinese have also been very aggressive in rejecting blame for covering up the spread of the virus in China in January. They have also been very aggressive in pointing out deficiencies in other countries' responses to the virus. There is actually an expression now among the Chinese diplomatic service. Some of their diplomats are called wolf warriors. And this is from a Chinese movie about Chinese special operations forces who fight against Americans. It's a movie. But now these diplomats who defend China's reputation and criticize other countries very openly, not very diplomatic manner, they now are actually creating indignation in places around the world. I just pulled this headline from the New York Times 2 weeks ago. Let me just give you an example of the kinds of things which the Chinese have done, which have angered some countries around the world. The Chinese ambassador in Paris, France, said that the Chinese government was simply letting old people in France die. The Chinese ambassadors in African countries have been called into African countries' foreign ministries to give explanations for why Chinese people in China are treating African citizens there very badly, and in some cases blaming African citizens for the spread of the coronavirus. Just to give you another example of the anger that the Chinese policy is creating, this is a poll from about 6 weeks ago in India. This is a poll of Indian citizens about the Chinese and the virus. And if you look at the blue, about half of Indians in this opinion poll blame China for the problem of the virus, and another 18% think that China not only is causing the virus, but is actually trying to use the virus as a weapon. So almost 70% of the Indians in this poll, the Indian citizens in this poll, have a very negative attitude about Chinese actions. So what the world is going to look like after this stage of the pandemic is finished. Pandemic could last for a long time. But when we think about it, the Russians are not going to be able to take over the world system. They have a very weak economy. It's important to remember, before this virus started, the Russian economy was not much bigger than the economy of Spain. China, as I mentioned, has its own problems. I spoke about the anger, the indignation that some of its actions have provoked. China's economy is also going to suffer. And the latest projections, which I have seen, suggest that Chinese economic growth will be 0 this year, and it will be the lowest number for Chinese growth since the 1960s. It is an economy which is, of course, very dependent on exports, and exports to places like Europe and the United States are going to diminish. The Americans, at the same time, have their own problems. I don't think I need to go into all of them with this group. I do think it's important to remind people that this is not the first time we have a president and we have a political movement in the United States that wants to stop leading the world and wants to withdraw a bit from the world. This is a poster from 1939, before World War II. And the Lindbergh in this poster is Charles Lindbergh, the famous American pilot who was the first one to fly an airplane over the Atlantic Ocean. And Lindbergh, before World War II, was urging strongly that the United States not get involved in the war against Germany. He was strongly in favor of American isolationism, and the people who backed him, many of them, were also very critical of Wall Street and the big financial companies. That's some of the people who back George Bush. I'm sorry, who back Donald Trump. Very quickly, there are similar kinds of populists and nationalists in Europe. Notice the darker colors here, Poland, Italy. We now have far-right elements in the parliaments of these countries. The movements in Europe are in many ways getting bigger. This is from a protest in Poland last year. This is before the virus. Here's one in Norway. I want you to think about that for a minute. Norway used to be one of the more liberal countries in Europe, but it is not anymore. And Frances was talking about the difficulties of refugees and internally displaced people. I think she's entirely correct. As I look forward and think about 2021, 2022, I think it's going to be even more difficult, especially in places like Europe, but probably also the United States, to take in large numbers of refugees if the economic situation is bad. And given that we have a 20% unemployment rate now in the United States, there is going to be public pressure against immigration into the United States. So, to conclude, just a couple of things. As we look forward, the United Nations and NATO and other organizations, European Union, Gulf Cooperation Council, are not going to be the ones to manage international crises. They're already weak, and they're not going to get stronger. Instead, in the absence of the American leadership, Chinese leadership, countries will react at a local, regional level. Countries like Turkey or Russia will intervene in conflicts in places like Syria and Libya, Iran reacting in places like Syria and Yemen. But Russia and China are trying to increase their influence around the world. Doesn't war anytime soon? I do not. Especially in the middle of an economic crisis, I think, if anything, there will be pressure to cut military spending in places like the United States and possibly even China. But as I look to the future, the Americans will need to think about how to rebuild alliances as China and Russia expand their influence. unless they're going to simply accept it and accept that China will be the dominant power in the Far East. I haven't heard any American officials say that yet. If they can't build alliances and they can't accept the expansion, then we will have a very unstable world. And I've noticed that a number of writers, including people like Robert Kagan and even Richard Haass, I think one of our questions asked about a book by Richard Haass, who compare this situation to the 1930s. I haven't said anything about Joe Biden and how he would approach this. He hasn't been elected, but I'm happy to talk about that during the questions. And I'll stop there, Osama. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Ford. Excellent, very informative, touched on very, very important aspect of this pandemic and the politics involved, the history of this. Although we have one point that we can discuss that, I think, but I would like to open the floor now for the audience here to see who has a question first, and otherwise we'll move on. I'm sure that we have quite a bit of questions here. We have about 6 of them. The first one is still for the first speaker. We'll put that later on until we get everybody else. We have a second one here. Is there any reason why the year-long Algeria's Hirak or popular huge demonstration is not being mentioned here? Is it because of its amazing peaceful aspect? Is it because of its peaceful aspect? That's one question. And then we have another question. What can be done to reduce barriers to UN Blue Beret deployment to stabilize and reduce inter-over violence, to facilitate accelerated peace processes and stimulate robust participation for supply and demand? So basically, what is the future of Algeria after the corona? Obviously, the person here is Algerian and quite keen to know that. Please give us some answers here.
Would you like me to start, Osama?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
This session of question and answer to you, and once this is done, then we will open it up for all the speakers.
Fine, as you like. Taht Amrak. So on Algeria, very quickly, the important thing to know, and people who live here in the United States, I think, know this, North Africa has never been an area where American citizens have paid much attention. They didn't pay much attention during the Algerian Civil War. Well, I was there in the 1990s. I think the person who asked the question dates back to that time as well. And the Hirak, the peaceful protest marches, are very impressive, and they get a lot of attention, for example, in French media, Belgian media, European media, but they don't get much attention here. There just isn't much American attention on Africa in general, and North Africa in part because it speaks French and Arabic mostly, not so much English. So it's just not an area where many Americans have knowledge or have much interest. Would you like me to address the second question about the Blue Berets?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. And the Blue Berets are United Nations peacekeepers. These are soldiers that are contributed by United Nations member states, and they go on peacekeeping missions around the world, Asia, Africa. They've been to Haiti in the Caribbean, been to Europe and places like former Yugoslav states. But it's difficult to get agreement to send them, and here is why. They can only be sent when the United Nations Security Council agrees to send them. There must be an agreement by the United Nations Security Council. And it is more and more difficult to get an agreement in the United Nations Security Council about regional conflicts. Russia has used a veto 14 times about Syria, 14 times. Many of those Russian vetoes, China also voted no. Usually not just Russia, it's usually Russia and China together. The last time there was an agreement on action by the United Nations Security Council with respect to the Middle East was Libya in 2011. And the Russians and the Chinese did agree to an operation by NATO to protect the city of Benghazi. Unfortunately, the war expanded beyond Benghazi, and for reasons I won't discuss here, we can if we want, but the Europeans and the Americans changed the mission from protecting Benghazi to overthrowing Gaddafi. It was a real change in mission, did not have permission from the United Nations. And since then, Russia and China have been rejecting any kind of United Nations peacekeeping mission because they suspect that the Americans will again change the mission. And in the absence of trust in the Security Council, it will be very hard to send blue berets anywhere. There has to be an agreement between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing.
Thank you. We have quite a bit of questions here. It seems like we have a question here from Saif Abdurrahman. He says, Ambassador Ford, what about the internal Middle East and North Africa realignment due to the pandemic?
I think what we will see over time, not right away, not quickly, is that as the United States diminishes, as the United States reduces the role it plays in the region, and it is reducing that role, that countries in the Middle East and North Africa will build closer relations with countries like China, with countries like Russia, maybe even in some cases military relations with countries like France. As I'm sure Saif knows, there just is not a large appetite here in the United States to be more involved in the Middle East. Even the terrorism argument, which sustained American interest, say between 2008 and 2017, 2018, even that has diminished. We don't see ISIS on the front page of the newspaper. We don't see it on page 2 of the newspaper. We don't even see it on page 10 of the newspaper every day now. China, Russia would like to have more influence, but the Middle East is far from China, and the Russian economy is not so big. So those countries cannot find big pots of money the way they would have found it the United States 20 years ago. And more countries in the region will have to develop relations with a variety of countries, and maybe they'll even have to undertake some domestic reform, although I was very interested and not so optimistic after listening to Professor Darrag.
Thank you. You have a greeting from an old friend, Wa'il Mirza, and a question for you. I don't know if you can read, you can see those questions now, but I'll be glad to read it here. It says in his recent book, The World, A Brief Introduction, Richard Haas states that despite what many think about a new world order resulting from the current situation, what's really happening is that every aspect of the contemporary world order is accelerating, meaning that nothing is fundamentally changing, but rather that we are witnessing the acceleration process of every world problem and challenge. What do panel participants think about this argument, and do you think that it is true or that a completely new world order will emerge, but especially to Ambassador Ford?
Well, I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but first, let me pass my greetings to my old colleague, Wael Mirza. Key point I would make, a lot of what Haas's argument was that the virus doesn't change the world, but it accelerates, it speeds up the changes that were happening even before. I think this is true. The American disengagement started before the virus, but I think we will see more of it. When we have an unemployment rate in America of 20%, most Americans are not going to worry as much about overseas issues, about foreign policy. They're going to be worried about the economy and jobs in the United States. It's always true, even in good times, but in bad times, it's especially true. But other things that Haas talked about in his article in Foreign Affairs about this, for example, that multinational institutions like the United Nations, like the European Union, like the Gulf Cooperation Council, they are not as unified, they are not as strong as they used to be. In the Gulf Cooperation Council, we have the whole issue about Qatar and its dispute with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. European Union, just think about the European Union for a moment. Italy was having a terrible problem with the virus, and the European Union sent no assistance for almost a month, sent no assistance to its fellow European member, Italy, for almost a month. Very damaging. The European countries, each one closed their borders and only now are starting to talk about reopening their borders. So the European Union, even with Brexit before the virus, now it's in an even more difficult situation. United Nations, I've already talked about. So I think he's right.
Thank you. I want you to stay. There's a question for Frances. She took us on a tour around the world, if you will, with the situations there. And in the session that was in Tuesday, they were talked about also the role of civil society, and the gentleman from Qatar today in his video talking about the social sector in this whole pandemic. Where do we see the trend going in order to help those either refugees or those poor countries to overcome the pandemic, knowing that there are a lot of hurdles in the countries that they are located, whether in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Europe, even some of them on the borders of, at least in Turkey, they've been taking good care, that the government there have been hosting more than 4 million people, so we can't really ask more. They're just part of the population there, but in other places, they're quite exposed. Where do we see this role, especially there was talk about there's much less money coming from government, it's more of the private sector. The question for Frances, where do you see this argument going?
Yeah, great question, and such an important topic. I think it's hard for me to totally project where I see the trend going, but I can say that for the past several years, I think there's been an increasing recognition that when we talk about refugees and when we talk about displaced people, and we think about how the world humanitarian architecture is set up to respond to them, these challenges, we really need to make a fundamental shift. Because if you think about how refugees were initially viewed, this is a temporary displacement, right? They're, you know, displaced by war, and they'll be back in their home countries in a year or in 18 months. And when you think about then all the assistance architecture that was built to support them, it was very temporary in nature, ad hoc, sort of not facilitating refugees and displaced people taking sort of putting down roots in the place where they've been dislocated to. I think now we collectively need to make a huge shift, because the average length of time of displacement has expanded in, you know, over 10 years, I believe, you know, maybe 20 years. Conflicts are lasting longer. So you've got, I don't need to tell this audience about the Palestinian story, but, you know, we've got displacement issues in places like Dadaab camp in Kenya, where displaced people have been there for generations. You know, they've grown up exclusively in the camp. So I think there needs to be a shift towards, instead of doing temporary assistance, sort of viewing refugees as humanitarian charges, letting them take control. They want to be self-reliant. They want to set up their own, you know, economic structures. So those conversations were beginning to happen, or have been happening for years. In 2016, there was the World Humanitarian Summit that the Obama administration took a leading role in, trying to sort of work through some of these issues. I think since then, we've really seen, going back to a theme of this talk that Ambassador Ford has eloquently spoken on, we've seen the US withdraw from a sort of leadership role in trying to shape some of those reforms. And I'm not quite sure what else is going on. We are, yes, simultaneously, we are seeing the private sector step up in many ways, which I think is overall encouraging. But there does need to be some larger coordination and efforts to make sure these efforts are all complementary, because the needs are, as this group knows infinitely well, so vast. And unfortunately, they're not going away anytime soon. So I think I'm hopeful that perhaps just the scale of this will lead to some reforms, but I do think we need a little bit more leadership on the international stage from the US and others to make it happen.
Related to that, there would be two questions. The first one, let me first get it to Ambassador Ford, also from his old friend. Another question is about the deterioration of economic, social, and security situation in Saudi Arabia, given MBS's policies in general and the crash in oil prices recently. What's your assessment of the potential consequences of this situation inside Saudi Arabia, and also regionally and globally? Basically, what's the impact of that along with the corona?
I'm not an expert about Saudi Arabia at all. I'm definitely not an expert. So I just have two thoughts which I would share with the group. Number one, when you cut subsidies and when you raise taxes and you don't give people any possibility to speak about it or to change it, to adjust it, I think it's almost a human reaction to be indignant and to be upset, to be angry. But that doesn't mean I expect big protests or big demonstrations in Saudi Arabia. That's not at all clear. I can imagine that as the Saudi economy contracts, many of the foreign workers will end up departing. Saudi citizens, I don't know if they will fill those jobs quickly. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. So we'll see. I think the Crown Prince in general, although he murdered Jamal Khashoggi and has treated the opposition very badly, and probably Professor Darrag could speak to that better than I could. But I don't see any Saudi opposition figure that would galvanize a protest movement and present a real threat to Mohammed bin Salman. I haven't seen any particular clerics or civil society figure emerge that is collecting and leading a protest movement against Mohammed bin Salman. And so therefore, I suppose the only thing he needs to worry about for now is opposition to him within the ruling family. And I would not even begin to hazard a guess about his relationships with his relatives. I think that is purposely kept very far away from public attention.
Great, thank you. Francis, what can you tell us about the Iraq and Algeria?
So I just wanted to make one additional comment to Ambassador Ford's comments on Iraq. I'll tell the questioner, the reason I didn't include it in my commentary was just mostly a bureaucratic one. At my organization, Carnegie, we've got another set of experts who are looking more broadly at global protest movements, global civil society, and then we've got an excellent Algeria scholar, Dalia Ghanem, who you may know. So since my overview was already very wide-ranging, I excluded the whole question of global protest movements, but I will say that 2019 was obviously a really exciting year for, we saw any number of peaceful and less peaceful protests. It was a real high watermark. And now a big question in many of these cases is sort of which of these movements will weather the coronavirus storm. Obviously, social distancing makes it hard. One trend that we've seen in general that I think we're seeing specific to Iraq as well is that many of these protest movements have sort of pivoted towards mutual assistance, mutual aid, response to the virus. And in many cases when the formal government authorities have been less quick on this. So I have seen reports out of Algeria. So I'm really curious to see where that goes. And I commend to you, my colleague Thomas Carruthers at Carnegie has a global protest tracker sort of looking at these trends in general, if anyone is interested. That's
Thank
it.
you. Great. Look, we had quite interesting questions and we really would love to continue with you. I'm going to continue until somebody tells me, Osama, I got to leave, then he'll leave. As long as you're here, we really would love to ask your questions because the next question is to Dr. Amr Darrag. With respect to Egypt, do you think now with the situation in Libya start to go against their wishes, do you think this compounded by the corona may start to bring within the system some kind of complaint that can pave the way for the opposition voices to seep into the Egyptian opinion and put some pressure, or this regime is really careless about whatever situation in Libya, whether they're losing or winning? After all, Saudi Arabia is the one who's paying for it.
Well,
within a short period of time so that we can get more questions for all of you.
Okay. Of course, Libya is a very important country for Egypt. It's quite strategic. And I know that there is some kind of opposition within the Egyptian regime to the current Egyptian approach, because the Egyptian regime is focusing on supporting Haftar. And now Haftar, there is a lot of uncertainty about his capability of uniting Libya and having a stable country as Egypt wishes. So, but for many reasons, Sisi will continue to support Haftar. So there is kind of opposition and kind of disputes about this within the Egyptian regime. But the problem is actually, we are not, back to some of the other questions and discussions. When people talk about protest movements and looking for protest movements and things like that, I don't think the model will continue to be like this maybe within the coming 2 years or so. What I've been talking about for Egypt, what I've been describing is a menu, is a recipe for chaos. We are not, I don't believe that this will lead to something similar to 2011. There is no organized movement that could take charge to have a decent organized protest movement that could really affect the regime. What I'm afraid will happen is some sort of chaos that will develop gradually, and at a certain point will go out of control. And why this is important for the whole area. I mean, we are talking, when we talk about Egypt, we are talking about 100 million people. Of course, the impact of something like that within the region will be so severe for the whole area. So we have very hot spots in Libya. We have a hot spot in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan, and if we have a big one, a big hot one in Egypt, we have a widespread chaotic scenario that would probably, and with, and if you couple that with the lack of interest from the United States and the international community in light of the latest developments, as was described particularly by Ambassador Ford, this would lead to some sort of uncontrollable chaos. What I think will emerge out of that is something that is probably independent of the international control. Some sort of internal forces, internal dynamics would emerge and starts a new phase of a new kind of development, which I refer to as the village type. You know, small developments that will give more focus to the human being, will have a new definition for the national security. People will talk about human security, which is actually will be more important, and it is more important now. So in light of what is happening everywhere, we will have something totally new in our area, in my opinion.
Thank you. It seems like our other colleagues have, I know the time was past, it is already 5 o'clock Eastern time. I know we told them only about an hour and a half. It is really more than an hour and a half now from the time that we were supposed to finish the session. And I understand everyone has schedules of other things to do. I'm very grateful for Dr. Amr Darrag. I know the time difference between here and Istanbul, it's way late at night for you. I appreciate hanging around with us. And I also express my thanks to Ambassador Robert Ford, who was very busy grading his students from Yale students, and but he did reserve the time for us to be with us, as well as Frances Brown, who also took time from her work to join us today and share with us very interesting topics, as well as a colleague who could not be with us live and sent his video from Qatar, Mr. Abd Ben Sahra. So thanks to all of you. This session will be available, and we will send you the link. And again, we appreciate your time being with us. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. Salam.